laying me down on the bed, pulling my pants on, and proceeded to try to perform oral sex. And nothing happened at 7 years old, right? And so from that day, it opened like that's when kind of the everything started spiraling. The abuse stopped when I started the process of learning to love me. Men started inboxing me like in droves, like preachers, men, husbands, fathers, like started hitting up my all of my social media platforms. Me too, me too, me too, me too. This happened to me. This happened, and before I knew it, I was like, oh my god, like this is an issue. Like this really is an issue.
Pouring rain falls on me again and again. Oh, can I afford to cry? I paid the price for every lie, and eye for an eye. Oh, why? Oh, why? I'm standing in a line of shame, just couldn't take the blame, hoping for a change, but everything's the same. It's still the same.
Hello, I'm Craig Heiting, and welcome to a conversation with Robert Marshall, a survivor of male childhood sexual assault and CSA activist, sponsored by the Men of Voices Beyond Assault.
I'm Lorward, Choi. As most of us here today, Craig and I are also survivors. Voices Beyond Assault hosts these monthly programs because we understand that men who suffer sexual assault are not always heard. We want to amplify their voices, empower them to heal, and provide the resources needed.
So with that, let me introduce our guest today, Robert Marshall. Robert endured physical and sexual abuse from 9 different men, beginning at the age of 4 and ending when he was 19.
But Robert was able to take control of his life and has become an inspiration and motivational speaker for men nationwide.
Based in Chicago, Robert started the nonprofit organization Iamman.inc and has written 6 books, including a bestseller called Echoes, which I have right here, and I have read, The Story of Male Survivors Overcoming Sexual Trauma.
Through his work, Robert has empowered thousands of men around the world to become the best version of themselves.
Along with his wife, Jackie, Robert is raising 3 young children while working on his doctorate in theology.
Robert, thank you so much for joining our program today. Your story of survival is just so incredible. And then you took that survival and you turned it into your life's work of helping other men reach their potential. And that is just truly amazing. And we're so thrilled to be able to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's great to
Thank
have
you.
you, Robert.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm just honored. Thank you guys. I love the work that you do, by the way.
We
I'm a huge
we
fan.
do as well. We're very big fans. In order for us to fully understand, we're going to get right into it.
Let's go.
In order
Let's
for us to
go.
fully understand your life and all the work that you're doing and how far you've come, it's first important that we understand where you came from. So, can you tell us a bit about your family, where you grew up, and how that first incident at just 4 years old happened?
So I grew up from well, actually, most people don't know. I was born in a place called Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's where I'm originally from. And I grew up in a single parent household, and I didn't know, I grew up in a space where I didn't have my father, and my mother actually was not honest with me about who my father was until I was about 25 years of age after I hired a private investigator to find out. And my first uh my first introduction to sex was through a cousin who was a teenager at the time. I was 4 years old. I was laying on a bunk bed, and he was on the floor. He pulled down his pants and pulled out his purse and said, "Robert, put your mouth on this." And that's where abuse started for me. We then, for whatever reason, we wound up moving to Georgia and a little hick town called Brunswick, Georgia. And it's a beautiful place outside, but for me, it's a place of a lot of pain. And for me, when I moved there, not shortly after we moved there, I had a friend whose mom became friends with my mom. Back in the day in the country, kids just roamed and did whatever. The us 80s babies, like we our parents had to, they didn't care as long as you were still alive when you came home when the street lights were on. And so one of the issues that I wound up having was being introduced to sex by my friend's brother, who happened to be our barber. And I talk about him in the book, and that started at the age of 7. At 7 years old, he was his parents lived in a trailer, and he cut my brother's hair, he cut his brother's hair, but my hair was the last head that he cut. And so I go into the room, and he's sitting. He has his wife beater on, and he starts cutting my hair. And all of a sudden, he turns on the TV. He puts a tape in the movie in the cassette player, in the whatever, the VCR. That's what it's called. In the VCR, and my life changed forever. Um, I remember seeing these people, you know, I didn't know what they were doing at the time. I know now it was sex, and I thought at 7 years old that they were peeing on each other. That's what I thought, and I said, "Why are they peeing on each other?" So he's cutting my hair, and he's watching porn, and he says to me, "You can do that." He said, "You can do that too." And I'm like, "Oh, at 7 years old." So he lays me on the bed and he says to me, "You can do that too." And as he pulls down my pants, he says, "You can't tell anybody, because if you do,
He
you'll."
tells you it's not pee, I think is right.
Yeah,
He
he
said
said, "Boy," he said,
that's
"Boy,
not
that's
pee.
not pee." He said, "Boy, that's not pee." And he said, "You can do
Yeah.
that too." And at 7 years old, I still remember the color of the sheets. They were burgundy and gold, and um, laying me down on the bed, pulling my pants on, and proceeded to try to perform oral sex. And nothing happened at 7 years old, right? Nothing. And then his words were, "Well, yours must not have come in yet." I still didn't know what that meant. And so he said, "Well, what I just did to you, I want you to do that to me." And so did that to him, and then he ejaculated, and I was taken back because I didn't know what was happening at the time. And he said, "See," and he took it from his hands and said, "See, boy, that's not pee. It's excuse me, this is nut." And I even still, and so from that day, it opened the like that's when kind of everything started spiraling. Um, from there, it went from, I wish I could say it was the first instance, but that was the only instance, but it was not. And so it started from there, and then it progressed to full on penetration. Um, and the first time penetration happened with him was, I was taking out the trash at my house, and he was a country thug type, like gold teeth and locks, and this kind of, I didn't somebody that you would not expect to demonstrate these behaviors. And so he walks, he's walking up to my block, to where I live, and I live in the country. It's dark outside, and he walks, and I'm in the backyard. He walks in a big open field, so he walks in the backyard and pulls himself out. And he taught me, by this time, this is 7, 8, 9 years, these are years that this is happening, pulls himself out, and then turns me around, and then literally spits on himself and shoves himself into me outside, on like by the trash can. And yeah, that and it was, yeah, that's that's yeah.
It's amazing, and it I can't even, yeah. It's so horrible.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
man. And so And that was, that was the starting, but I feel, and research shows us that, boys who are abused are more prone to abuse, um, or to be abused. And so, little did I know that, he was already on the sexual offenders list, and he went to jail already for for abusing a child. And so he had free range to me. No, nothing happened. Nobody. He made me always feel like it was my like I would get in trouble. And it made way for another person I talk about a lot is the preacher. In my book, as well as in the web series I just released not too long ago. The preacher started when I was in fifth grade, and I was in a mentorship program about abstinence, believe it or not, in fifth grade. And from there, we were at a church service somewhere and at a concert, and I was walking home at night, and he pulls up in this little red truck, and he's my mentor, he's my big brother, so I don't think anything of it. He's like, "Hey, let me take you home, so you're not walking." I'm in fifth grade. It's the country, so it's just a different time. And so I he says, "Let me take you home." And I said, I don't think anything of it. I get in the car, and he says to me, "Hey, I'm about to open a church in this area. Let me show you." Um and I'm like, "Okay, great." I'm a church baby. Most people don't know. Like, I play piano, I sing, I do a lot of all these things. And so I'm like, "Of course." And so we go to this big building, and he has a key to it. It needs a lot of renovations, and I don't know how. I don't remember the conversation, but all I remember was walking into the building. I remember seeing him unlock the padlock from off the door and walking around. You really couldn't see. There was a little lamp in a room, and all I remember is being on the table and him shoving himself inside, like forcing me to perform oral sex, and then forcing himself inside of me, and being in fifth grade. And I remember afterwards, he looked at me and asked me, "You like that? You like that?" And I'm like, and I said, "I don't know." Fifth grade at this time. And he says to me, "Well, something's wrong with you. You have a spirit. You have a demon, essentially. And you need to," he said, you have a spirit of perversion, and you need to go pray and pray that residue off of you." And so that lasted for from fifth grade always all the way off and on to 19 years of age. Um, and during that also that same time, I was I thought I was in a relationship with I was in a relationship with a teacher who was a woman, and I was 13 when the relationship started, and she was 23. And from 13 to until 17, 18 years of age, we were quote unquote dating, um, and did not realize that you know what was happening was that I was being controlled and manipulated, groomed to have sex with her. She taught me, she taught me how to please her and how to, and whatnot. And it lasted until I was 17 years old. And when I turned 17, I was 17, about to turn 18. She looked at me and she said, "Now you have to marry me." And I looked at her and said, "No, like, no, I'm about to go off to college. Like, and I'm getting a little older." And so a lot has happened, with other abusers. I've had non-abusers over my life. These were like some of the consistent, like, abusive relationships, but I've had other teachers and other politicians and trusted people in the community, who held status positions that wound up becoming my abusers. Um, and so abuse, and here's the part. So the transition was when I moved to Chicago at 18 years old. I said, I was carrying the weight and the guilt of all of these things that were literally transpiring at the same time. Not realize, but always thinking that I was the person with the issue. This was my fault. I was nasty. And I wanted to get away. I wanted a new start. I wanted a fresh start. And when I moved to Chicago, the actual teacher, she followed me. And so she moved to the. She said she was going to come back to school for her master's, and so she moved to the dormitory right next door to mine as a grad student, and in hopes that we would connect, or, and she could no longer control me anymore with sex, and so when that didn't happen, she moved back home to Georgia, and so now, I didn't at this time I did not realize I didn't have the verbiage for what I experienced. All my life, I thought I was the one that had the issue. I was the one that was nasty. I was the, whatever. I was the hoe. I was the horrible person that just was out here. And not realizing what I was really dealing with was the effects of trauma that I did not have verbiage or verbiage to define. And it was impacting me in ways that I did not even know. So when I moved to Chicago, and I got in school, I kind of, I started to, kind of spiral, as I got older, as I started spiraling, not realizing what was going on. And through all of that, um, you know, through all of that, processing that, I wound up getting married. Long story fast forward, wound up getting married, and I had my first child, well, first two children. And, well, and a matter of fact, no, it was my first son. And I realized what started my journey to wholeness was I became jealous of my children. I knew I was a great father, but I started to have resentment and almost hate towards my son. And I knew I loved my kids, so I was like, "What is going on here? What is this?" And I realized that I was angry because they had the father that I always wanted. They had the protection that I always wanted. And what was making me angry was they had it and it was too late for me to get it.
Yeah.
Because as a married man, you're the father now. So um and so at this point, I still didn't know who my father was. And so that's what started my journey to wholeness. So that's what started my journey, realizing, you know what? Like, and I had a mentor tell me, like, Robert, you do realize, I remember the day he said to me, Robert, you do realize that you were a kid when this stuff happened. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, I thought it was I always thought it was my fault. And he said, Robert, how old were you? And I told him 4, 7, 8, 9, 10. He said, and they were 30 and 40 and 50, 60-year-old adults, but you're responsible. How does that make sense? And I never had somebody show me or tell me, like, and put it in plain layman's terms, that made me realize, like, wait a minute, I did not, like, at those ages, even as a teenager, you don't cognitively have the
Right.
ability to really comprehend the full extent of what you're engaging in, and therefore not really able to consent because you don't know. And
Yeah.
so for me, when I realized that, it hit me like a ton of bricks, and I realized that my children deserve the best version of me, which meant I needed to be.
So that's a horrific story, and we want to unpack a little bit about that. And I think we have a couple of questions um, about some of those things, not the specific abuse, but some of the effects that it had on you. I wanted to ask, did you ever wonder why, when you were a kid, this kept happening? Because I hear this a lot from survivors, and it happened with me as well. Why me? Why is this happening to me over and over again? Why does it happen again and again uh, to those who are being abused, to those of us who are being abused when we're children? Why does it keep happening? Have you found this in your work and found answers to that?
I think that's a layered answer. So number one, I always say living in any why question when it comes to abuse is sometimes a means to a dead end and leads you in a whole bunch of darkness. It kind of just is an endless tunnel. But for some of the, for just to answer some of on a very light note, I think number one, hurt people hurt people. One of the things that I did was I had the opportunity to go back to some of my abusers and ask them, why did you do this? Especially the barber. I went back because I saw him on Facebook and I saw that he had children, and his children were about the same age that I was when he started abusing me. And I asked him why. I said, "You have kids, and to be and I'm just going to tell you what his response was. His response was, "Well, number one, I thought you wanted it." These are his words. He said, two, and to be honest, he said, "I'm not saying it's right, but it also happened to me too." And
It happened to him, so he was also abused.
see, he was abused as well. But by the time he was, a teenager, he had already started sleeping with other or taking advantage of other young children.
But was the
And
barber
so
abused by when he was a child? Is that what he was telling
he was abused as well. Yes,
Okay.
the barber told me. He said he was abused. He said he was abused, and he actually apologized. Um, he was out of all my abusers, he was one of the ones that did apologize. And I realized, like, you know what? Hurt people hurt people. Like, really? Like, hurt people. And it does not mean that everyone who has experienced sexual abuse will abuse someone else. But, and that's why I said this is a layered answer, because there's really no clear cut answer. I believe some people have mental illnesses. I believe some people are broken themselves. I think some people, I think the why question is one that you will continue to ask yourself throughout your years. But instead of asking the why question, I ask myself what question. So this happened. Now, what are we going to do? How are we what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do to begin your journey to wholeness? How are you going to use this to create change so that it does not happen, and you're able to help others move forward as you've been able to? So that's, instead of asking myself why questions, why did this happen? He was broken, right? He was broken at the end of the day. And that's pretty much what it is. And because of the brokenness of the world, stuff happens. And this is not to say it's right, not to say it was supposed to, not to say that we should not pursue justice, but at the end of the day, when you come to, I think it's a foundational understanding that broken people do broken things, and they break other people. So that's how I answer the why question, and then I focus on the what. What's next? I can't help what happened to me, but I can. It is my responsibility to determine what I'm going to do with it and how I'm going to move forward in my own life. And sometimes that means accepting apologies that you'll never get. And that was the catalyst in my journey and many of the men's journey that I work with now is what now?
Yeah, Robert, I think you touched on something really beautiful here, where you said you stop looking for whys. And I think sometimes I know for myself, when I look for a why, I'm looking to put fault on someone. I'm looking to say, this is your fault. This is not my fault. But I think you touched on something beautiful where you said, you start to look for the why, and you take responsibility and you say, the tragedy of life has happened to me. How am I going to transform this into something else? And that's a huge question for people to be able to ask themselves, to look at the things that they've gone through in their life and just look at it in like all sobriety and to say, this terrible thing that happened to me, I will take and transform it. Um, what I did want to ask you is, you're covering a lot of your story, but I think you kind of grazed over this transition of like, you're a kid, like a lot of this abuse is continuing to happen to you. Where does this kind of stop for you? Like, how does that abuse finally end for you? And you're just able to, is it kind of when you transition into going into college, which I think is a whole nother question that I have, or yeah, where does that abuse kind of end for you?
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time?
Yeah, where does the abuse end for you? Because there's this long line of all these people that are coming into your life, taking advantage, and so where does that kind of stop for you?
Where did it stop for me? How did it impact me?
How
Are
did
those
it
the
end?
questions I just want?
How did it end? How did you end it? How did you stop being abused?
Well, number one, I the abuse stopped when I realized that when I started the process of learning to love me. Um, One of the things that my abuse did, not having a father, it was kind of this. I've always, and I think every boy wants love, affection, to be seen and to be heard and to be protected by their father, by male role models, whatnot, positive male role models in their life. And I realized as I got older that what I wanted and what I was always looking for was affirmation, to be seen and to be heard, and um and affection and safety from a father figure. But and I feel like my abusers knew that, they could see that, and they took advantage of it. And what they taught me was that the only way that I would ever be able to get affection from a man was performing sexually to please him. And when I came to the realization that my life, like who that I was enough and that I was seen and I was heard. And this is why for me, my faith, this is not for everybody, but for me, my faith journey is a part of my process. Because for me, and me alone, um, that was an element that brought a level of affirmation to me, and gave me a safe space and a community in which that I could begin processing through my stuff. And I realized that I didn't have to turn tricks for love. I didn't have to sexually, you know, exploit myself or put myself in compromising situations, to feel seen and to feel heard. And for me, after I got in college and I realized that the teacher could no longer manipulate me with sex, I started taking control of my own body and saying, you know what? I don't have to do this. And when you are and so when this and that was a big thing for me, because when sex starts at 4 and those ages and you're exposed to porn and whatnot, like it it you're groomed into this. And so it becomes natural, it becomes normal to you. And so through college, every what it did was I spiraled and I just started sleeping with anybody and everybody that I wanted to, because I was looking for something, and this is how I was grown. I was all it created this hypersexuality, this hypersexual kind of space for me, and it didn't matter if it was with men or with women. It was because I was groomed by both. So it was just
Did
kind
you
of
feel
like,
like did you feel like you were only valued if you could perform sex, or what was going on?
so I'll say it like this: with women, like if I was sexually active with a woman, it made me feel like I was a man. And if it was sex with a man, it made me it made me feel safe. It made me feel wanted. It made me feel seen, because my abusers made me think that I was safe with them, and our secrets is what bonded us and what kept me safe,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense.
And so with my abusers and with, um like I just, yeah, with people, and so with men, it was, I actually came out to my family as bisexual, so I was just kind of out here, and it didn't matter. It was, if I slept, if I wanted attention from, and it almost became a game, almost to for me, like I can get you, I can make you love me, I can make you see me, I can make you want me, and not realizing that those were trauma responses, and those are effects of the trauma, of the abuse, and being groomed by both men and women growing up as a
Yeah, because when you talk about When you talk about looking for love from men, were you talking about were you sexually attracted to men, or were you looking for love from the male companionship that you didn't get from not having a father, and you were looking for that father figure all along? Or and what how did this confuse you? You said you're bisexual. I don't know if you still are. How this is a lot, you know.
So,
How do you get through all of that? I
so
mean,
I think I say it like this: under the radar, yes, I was looking for the affirmation, the love, the protection from a man that is natural. It is natural for me having kids. It is natural for a boy to be to have intimate time with his father and with other men in his family, with his uncles, with his grandfathers, to be hugged, to be kissed, to be if there's affection is the word. Healthy levels of affection. It brings safety. It brings affirmation. It brings, it does something for him. And my abusers provided that with a price. But they taught me that the only way I could get it was giving up of my body. So now my body has been trained, and it's almost like it's like now that my body has tasted it, it is and it has been groomed in it. It's not just once. This is a continual process. I was exposed to it, so now I did have an attraction to men. I was attracted to men because it was this is all that I knew. This is how it started out for me. And I tell people what happened was my abusers took my power to choose who I wanted to be. I was what was placed on what I it was almost like at a before I could even form at 4 years old, before I understood what homosexual being homosexual or bisexual or heterosexual was, it was already chosen for me. And so by that time, I had already developed an appetite for it because I was consistently groomed by it. And so also for women, like for the teachers, it was a relationship. And I played, and hear me, I played sports, I played football, I played baseball. So it like I was also socially around other guys who, if you didn't have a girlfriend, you were seen as, you were seen as less. And no offense to anyone, but in urban context, you never wanted to be seen as weak. You never wanted, it was not socially acceptable to be seen as gay. And so the last thing you wanted to be called was gay. And so you just, and I had this teacher who, this woman who was giving me energy of, I'm attracted to you and also wanted to have sex with you. And I had never had sex with a woman before. And so it was like, as a teenager, boys who are exposed to sex prematurely by women in urban context is seen as an initiation into manhood and masculinity. And so it was amongst my peers or people who knew, it was like, oh, okay, all right, we see you. And it was an affirmation, it was an affirming. And so I developed an appetite for both spaces. But at the same time, it was other people other people or adults choosing for me, not me ever having the power to choose myself. So as I got older, because because I had more encounters with men, of course, for me, men, it was just easier because I knew how to please a man. I knew what it took. I knew how to speak the language. I knew, by that time, I developed a sexual appetite for it. And so, yeah, so it was on one layer. Yes, there was a deep rooted thing of me wanting to be seen, heard, protected, loved, affirmed by a man that I thought I could only get by sexually pleasing a man. Um, but also that developed, a physical, now I have preference. I can choose. And now sex with who I choose, it was almost like me taking back my power. It was almost like me taking control. I choose this type, or I want this type. And with women, it was just being seen, being able to prove in my social context that I was a man or manly or had some element. So it created this weird dichotomy within me, in this war that I'd always had to kind of deal with.
There seems to be a lot of kind of systems that you're surrounded by that really affect your choices. You know, either people making choices for you, people affirming the things that maybe aren't the best for you, people, yeah, just losing a lot of agency in that choice. And you had mentioned something, was going to college in this context like a very common occurrence, or was this a little bit more rare? And then I have a follow up off of that.
So going to college, you said?
Yeah, was going to college like a rare, or
Oh yeah.
was it very normal?
That it was rare for where I grew up. You know, number one, 50% of our class did not graduate. Like that's number one out the at the gate. And for men who grew up where I grew up, boys did, they either were incarcerated or dead. Right, where I grew up was the same city that Ahmaud Arbery was killed. So I went to the same school as Ahmaud Arbery. So if you can understand that context, that's how I grew up. So there were systems of privilege and racism and prejudice that I did not have, I was not aware of. I just grew up in it. I grew up in it. And so it was not until I went to college, and one of the only reasons why I was able to go to college was because the teacher who was my girlfriend. So when a woman so I've learned, and especially the work I do, um, when boys are groomed by women, it takes a different role. It takes a different form. It's not just sexual in nature. It's motherly. It's nurturing. It's supportive. And multiple men that have been exposed to sex by women prematurely, they've all said the same thing. Like if it was consistent, it was nurturing. It was loving. It was not like sex happened, but it was not sexually driven, right? And so with the men, it was sexually driven. You knew what it was. A lot of them, they hated, so for instance, I don't know if I'm getting too much, but I haven't shared this much, but with the preacher, for instance, the preacher, it was never an intimate sexual experience. It was very, all right, we're gonna, I'm gonna pick you up. We're at a park somewhere. He pulled down his pants, and I knew what to do, and he just turn you over, shove it in, and be like, and it was done. Like, however long it lasted, that's what it was. Dropped you off back home, and that was it, right? But with the woman, it was more relational. It was more intimate. And so because of her, I was able to go to school. She helped me get into the school that I went into. Matter of fact, I went to her alma mater in Chicago. And that's how I even got introduced to Chicago, because of her. And so I never, even with her, I never saw it as abuse, or I never saw it as grooming. I never saw it as and at most statutory rape, if anything. But I never saw it until I got married. And when I was talking to my wife about, my journey and, all the men, and she's like, Robert, that was abuse too. And I'm like, what? Like, no, she helped me. Like, if it wasn't for her, like, I wouldn't have got, she helped me write my college application. She helped me do all these things. And yeah.
How old was she?
So,
How old was she at the time?
when we started, she was 23 and I was 13. So we went from 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, about 13, 14, 15. Yes, I was about 18, 18, 19. So 18, 19. So all throughout my high school experience, we were dating.
Yeah.
So 23, 24, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah, so she was
So she
almost 30. Yeah.
almost 30. And little did I know, I'm thinking, and here's the other part. The little did I know that, I'm having sex with her multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day as a high school student. So it would be sex with her, sex with him, sex with her, sex with him. Like, and it would be this, kind of ping pong thing. And I thought with her that she never got pregnant because we never used protection. And I just thought I had a strong pullout game. But from age 13 to 18, 19 years old, you're having sex with somebody, and there's not even one pregnancy scare. I didn't come to find out until after I was an adult that she could not have children. And so that was a whole nother layer of like, wow, this really was something, could have been something else. So yeah.
So, so did she know that about the other? Did she know that while she was in a relationship with you, you were being abused by men? Okay.
No.
Um, how did you decide to come forward and talk publicly about your abuse? Were you afraid of being labeled gay? You mentioned earlier in your community, there had to be a lot of thinking and courage and how you were going to do it. Tell us a little bit about how you came publicly forward.
So my background is in higher education leadership and administration. And during that time, I was working as a dean in higher education. And when I realized I needed to start telling my story, and part of this was my faith journey as well. When I felt like I needed to start talking about it, I was scared because I said, you know what? I'm going to be blackballed. I'm going to be, and by this time I was married as well, to my wife. And I was afraid that people were going to judge my wife. I thought they were afraid, that they were going to judge my children. By this time, my wife and I, we've been married, 3-4 years by this time. And I remember talking to my wife and saying to her, like, I won't do this if you're not comfortable. Like, because I was the first Black male that, in her family that, my wife is Latina. So she's Puerto Rican and Mexican. And so even between Black and brown relations, that's a whole other element. And so I told her, I said, hey, I don't want to cause, I don't want your family to look at, you crazy because of this. And she looked at me and she said, she said, how can't you? Like, you have to do this. And as long as she was okay with me doing it, at the end of the day, I didn't care about anybody else. And when I started talking, then I started getting this domino effect. Men started inboxing me, like in droves, like preachers, men, husbands, fathers, like started hitting up my all of my social media platforms. Me too, me too, me too, me too. This happened to me. This happened, and before I knew it, I was like, oh my God, like this is an issue. Like this really is an issue. And which pushed me to have my first live event for male survivors. And it was right before the pandemic, and over 90 some odd men and their partners showed up. And I realized then, like, yeah, this is a big problem. And
You weren't alone.
Especially in urban context. Yes.
Yeah.
And mind you, the majority of these men were Black and Latino men. Like there were other races that there were, some Asian, Caucasian, but the majority of the room was Black and Latino men on the various sexual identification spectrum. So I realized that abuse had no respect of person. The effects of the trauma are drastically different for each person. There's not a one size fits all experience. And so yeah, and from there, one of my friends who I grew up with that I didn't even know, to be honest, that he had been abused too. He said, that happened to me too. And he was a lawyer. He had went to Yale and he was well off. I hadn't seen him in years. And he saw my story and he's like, yo, you need to do something with this. And so he was like, you need to start an organization. You need to do. And I was just like, okay. And I tried to work with other organizations. I wanted to work, I had my degrees. I wanted to work for, some other organizations. But to be honest, they did not respond. So, I reached out, they didn't respond. And so I never started this journey to start an organization or to start a movement. I just knew I had to do something. And after doing that, he was the one who he connected me with a lawyer who paid for all the startup stuff of the organization, who did it all pro bono. And That's how we started. And from then to now, we've done a number of things. We produced several books, several resources. We've done groundbreaking work, grassroots work in various communities. We've had facilitated dialogues. We've had conversations with faith communities, educational institutions, social service organizations. We've done dialogues, conferences, online virtual meetups. Like we've done it all to really understand our narrative, to get the narrative, to tell the story of these guys. And so research has been a very big part of what we do because we realize even in the statistical data that is shown for male survivors of abuse, it does not oftentimes include the narrative of men in urban communities, let alone men who experience abuse at large. So,
I think I want to trace back a little bit. I think you deciding to come forward and publicly talk about your abuse, you're obviously very afraid. And I think it's amazing to see you have your wife's support in that. Um, and it seems like her initial reaction was just one of enthusiasm and support and saying, "You have to do this. I encourage you." And I think you had mentioned before you had already told her prior to you speaking publicly about your story. Is that correct?
yeah.
Okay. I want to dive into a little bit. You know, you've said it's harder for men of color to kind of come forward with their stories of abuse. And kind of what elements do you see that factor into that?
It's the shame, it's the guilt, it's isolation, it's being seen as weak. Also, most of the time, men who experience sexual abuse are at the hands of, close family friends or family members. So if they say something, then it causes a rift um, in family structures or in close family friend settings. Also, sometimes if they're abused by women, they don't see it as abuse. Research shows us that most men who've experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a woman does not see abuse until 20, 25 years after the abuse happened. And so they've been impacted in ways that they don't have verbiage freedom for. They've not been able, most men in urban communities, and I want to be clear when I speak about urban communities because I believe through our research we found out that sexual abuse for boys is more of a socioeconomic issue than anything. And so it's not necessarily race; it's economics, right? It's a social and economic issue, and so that includes Caucasian men, that includes Asian men, that includes Indian men. It includes people who identify as who are on the bottom finance of the bottom food chain and social spaces. Those are the men who are more, or the boys who are more prone to experience sexual abuse, and not just in America, worldwide. And so uh, with most men, boys, we don't say anything because it costs too much. And if it's at the hands of a woman, right, it's not. It seems like most men struggle with thinking that their body, like if they had an erection or even if they ejaculated during the sexual encounter, that they were what's the word I'm looking for? They were agreeing to or consenting to the sexual encounter or experience, and that is not the truth. Um, the anatomy of a male's body, we are like as long as a, there's a stimulus,
Mhm.
our bodies typically are going to respond. And most men, who are survivors, feel like their bodies betrayed them and because maybe they necessarily didn't want it but they got an erection, and because they had an erection the abusers use that as kind of a tool of manipulation to say, hey, you want this, and you know even that there's when male genitalia are penetrated or in either way there are levels of pleasure. So even if like most some men they feel like, how can this be abuse if I receive levels of pleasure from it? And so whether that's through their penis or through their anus, like a lot of men they are conflicted, so they just don't say anything at all. Because there are level of, the G spot gland for the male is in the anus, and so if they're physically being penetrated and that penis is hitting their anus, like there's a level of pleasure that they're getting. Not saying that it's always pleasurable, not saying that, but for some men, it's kind of like, I did have some level of pleasure, and even with their penis, like if they had an erection or they had an ejaculation, they ejaculated during the process, it creates even more of a fog for them to see it as abuse. And so, for to answer your question, like the, the fog, once like what helped me process through all of this was the research that we were doing and seeing other men. Like when they saw me come forward, they gained the courage to come forward, and I started seeing the fruit of that in the work that we were doing. And we started realizing that men did not come forward because of systems of shame and guilt from their encounters, that they did not ever have the cognitive ability to really process through, or never had the space or the freedom or the money to process through. So they just folded up, put it in the corner, forgot about it, or tried to forget about it until it bleeds over in their life and they have to do something.
You talk a lot about the support that you got, and when you came forward with your story, that you had all these men come forward. Were there any instances or fears of not being believed, of not having your story believed? And have you encountered other men and that haven't been believed? And why is it important to believe survivors? I mean, they have no proof. And we just did one of our episodes with Wade Robson, and the amount of response that we got was there were a lot of supportive, but a lot of people were like, "No, that never happened. We don't believe him." And this is a problem for survivors coming forward. What if they don't believe me?
Yeah. For me, when I started telling my story, I said in my new web series that he actually called me and threatened me and said I was lying. And I'm gonna be honest, it hurt. And what hurt was not him calling me and threatening me, because I had already talked to my lawyer, so I was fine. What hurt was his gaslighting made me question what I knew I'd experienced. So I came back like, did I really do that? Did I really experience that? Was that really that? And this is me traveling, talking about, and me now coming to a place where I'm questioning, am I lying? Is this all a figment of my own imagination? And these are forms of dark psychology that abusers use to keep their victims in silence. But there is this fear of not being believed. There is this fear that if I say something, because most time men don't talk about it or don't acknowledge it till 20, 25 years after. So by that time, in the past, it was beyond the statute of limitation in most states for anything to be done. If the abuser is still alive, right, then it's like, okay, it's 25. I'm an adult now, or I'm grown, so why even bother with it? And then the fear of not being believed, what that may do to him internally. So now that I've even gotten the courage to talk about it, not being believed, it has the potential to break somebody. Mm-hmm. And so there are men who are afraid that they won't be believed. In some cases, I've not been believed, right? I've not been believed. Like, why did you wait? I've gotten why didn't you wait? Why did you wait until you were adult? Why didn't you say anything? A lot of people who knew me then, because I was a well-known kid, was like, well, I wish I would have known, or I love you and him, and I wish, and I'm just like, and I learned, and I want every survivor, male or female, to hear me when I say this. People's opinion of what happened to you is none of your business. They were not your, typically abuse happens in the dark, and they were not there with you. You were. And so two people do know the truth, you and the person that hurt you. And if that's all the truth and support that you have, it's enough.
Well said.
Yeah. We had a question in the chat of, you're sharing your story, you're being open about, you're confronting your abusers, which I think is a whole foray that we can go into. But I think it's more interesting to ask, how did you come to this place of forgiving yourself? Because you said for a long time you had blamed yourself, you thought it was your fault. So what does that process look like for you to be able to look at yourself and say, you know what, I forgive you?
Or forgive myself. So it's real simple. When I realized that it was not my fault to begin with, when that mentor looked at me and made me realize that it was not my fault, then I realized it's not my weight to carry. So I decided at that point and it didn't just start, I had to go through a process of saying, this is not my fault. I did not do this. The blame is not on me. I was not the sick one. I was not the broken one. I was the one being broken. I was the one that, and so it was liberating, because you're always looking to place blame somewhere. The why question, why? Well, I must have wanted it, or I wasn't, my abusers told me, hey, this is you like this. You need to go pray. They always put the guilt back on me. But when I realized that it was their guilt, it was their shame, it didn't belong to me, that made the process of forgiving myself a lot easier. And it made the possibility of forgiving them a lot more palatable, because I realized that they were hurting and broken before they hurt me, and that they were not necessarily big and bad, the big bad wolf or the villain in my story. Oftentimes, and I love Marvel movies, and I realize, and in any kind of movie you see, oftentimes the villain is somebody who experienced an injustice that never got the help or recompense that they wanted or that they felt like they deserved, and so they went to seek vengeance as a response to not getting the help or the healing or the or whatever they needed. And so, with that being said, when I realized and I started de-vilifying my abusers, when I started de-vilifying them, it made forgiveness that much more palatable.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about faith, because we talk about, there's been a lot of talk about the Catholic Church and the abuse that happened with priests and altar boys or whoever, and you were abused by a preacher. How does that affect you? Did you ever want to blame the church or blame God? And you're a minister now, so that's almost like counterintuitive to what I hear about people who were abused from members of the clergy, who they turn away from God, they turn away from faith, it's a terrible thing, and you've embraced it instead. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So yes, I can. A lot of people that I deal with, I always ask the question, how could God allow this to happen to me? And one of the reasons why I study theology, because I have to have an understanding of the Bible and God, and it made me want to question even more. And so, number one, I realized I realized that it was not God's fault what happened to me. It was not his fault. I realized that, as a theology student and someone, as a man of faith, I realized that because of the fall and the brokenness of the world, God gave man free will and said, and this is scripturally, and I'm just, you asked, so I'm just going to, and not to offend anybody, but this is just my journey, that God gave man free will. When God created earth, he said, I've given you dominion. This is your territory. You do all. This is where you reside. I've given you dominion over that. He also gave man free will. And so whatever man decides to do with his free will is his choice. And I realized that when I looked throughout the narrative of the Bible, that God was always concerned with, and always pursued justice for the oppressed, for the downtrodden, for the least of these, for the abused, always. And when I realized that God, as a loving father, is concerned about the things that concern me, or he's hurting for about the things that hurt me. And there's a one scripture that says, "Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord." Right? And I realized throughout the scripture, throughout the Psalms, that there are so many scriptures that talks about God avenging those who have been abused, those who have been, those who have been mishandled. And even when it talks about specifically children, he says, do not harm these children. It is better for you to place a big rock around your neck and drown yourself in the ocean, right? It's that type of imagery that comes from the Bible. So I realized people who represent God can be broken. It does not mean God is broken. It means that they took their free will and decided to do something that God does not condone with their free will. Why didn't God stop it? Because if God gave us free will, if he stopped all of it, if he stopped it, then it would not have been man's free will. Like it would go against the free will that he gave man. But what I noticed on the other side, through faith, he offers healing. There's another scripture that says, healing is the children's bread, right? It is something that I'm able to eat of every day, that he provides healing. He provides wholeness along my journey. And so for me, when I realized it was not God's fault, it was broken people's fault, who are oftentimes broken before they became clergy people, right? These are issues that they had before. So it made me say, you know what? God is the one who has been there with me. And when I realize he laments and he cries over the things that I'm crying over, when he's there and he says stuff like, "I'll never leave you, neither will I forsake you, I'll be with you," right? He was there crying with me. He was there. But there's another, that there's no thing unto man that or temptation. There's no temptation that's known unto man that he is not aware, that he has not experienced. So it's like he wrapped himself in flesh. He's able to understand my struggles, my hurts, my hangups, all the issues that I've gone through, and he's there to walk with me through them, to help me along my process. Right? He couldn't stop him, but he didn't stop him. He couldn't stop because that would go against his free will. Do we say the same thing with every murder or with every negative thing that goes on? What if God intervened for every negative thing? Like, you would no longer be free will. You would be a robot. So in all of this happening, there is a journey or a process that I believe that God wants and desires for all of his children to experience healing and wholeness, and he will avenge he will avenge whatever that looks like. And now, if I have any place of contention sometimes in my faith, that's the place of contention. Well, God, when are you going to avenge? How are you going to avenge? And that's just me being transparent in my humanness, because I want God to get them like they got me. I want them to hurt like I was hurt. I want them to be embarrassed like I was embarrassed. And then I have to come to my senses and realize, God, that forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person. Forgiveness has more to do with me and my journey so that I can move. There's a quote that I say all the time. Unforgiveness is like drinking poison, waiting for the other person to die. Unforgiveness inside of the body, it is like poison in our body. It breathes. When it festers, it turns into bitterness. It turns into hatred, and it consumes you. And I don't want to be consumed by anybody or anything that is negative. I want to exude light and love. And so my faith has been a part of that journey. And the work that I do, even though this is how rooted I am in my faith, the work that I do is inclusive. So there's people from all walks of life, from various, belief systems that we walk with, and we just journey with them. It's not our job to define what wholeness looks like. It's not our job to define what healing looks like. It's just to walk alongside them as they journey to wholeness, one healing step.
Let's dive into a little bit about your work. You said you started a nonprofit group called Iamman in 2019. You mentioned a lawyer that really helped you along this process and gave you a lot of client assistance and did a lot of work pro bono. But why did you decide to do this? And yeah, like kind of tell us about the process of getting started in that area.
I started to do that because I realized that, and when I started realizing the magnitude of this stuff, like I realized that somebody had to do something, and there was not a lot of people who were actually doing something about it. In our research, the first thing I started to do was researching, and I realized in my research that victims of sexual abuse and sexual trauma, men in urban communities, that there's a line between the disenfranchised, between the single parent household, the school to prison pipeline, incarceration, violence, recidivism rates, and death rates, premature death rates. And a lot of these spaces, the line is many of these boys and men have experienced some form of sexual abuse or trauma, or has been exposed to sex prematurely, and never have had the space to process or journey to wholeness. And because of this, they have adopted self-sabotaging behaviors as trauma responses to cope with the pain that they don't even have verbiage for. So my question was, where do broken and hurting men go? I asked that question, where do they go? And especially from urban communities, where do they go? Because women, they have conferences, they have social organizations, they have community organizations, and not to say that they deserve all of that and need it. But for men in urban communities, especially who look like me, they either go to prison or they go to an early grave. And I was not okay with that. And so I've made it my life's work. My life's work. I want it to be my legacy to help boys and men journey to wholeness from adverse childhood and traumatic life experience.
In 2022, you wrote the book Echoes, which included the stories of 14 other male survivors, including yourself. Why did you choose the name Echoes, and was it difficult to find people to participate in the book?
So we wrote. So the book Echoes, I started writing it when I started telling my story initially. But to be honest, when I started writing, like every word was F you and F this and so I realized I was not healed enough to write that book at that time. So I backed away and said, you know what? I cannot put this book out. Every other word is an F bomb. So I can't do it. And so I said, you know what? Let me back up. And I took some years to do some work. I still told my story, but like I told you, as I told my story, I was already surrounded by so many other men, and I had formed this circle of guys that had similar stories to mine. And I thought it would be selfish of me to just include a book like this and only include my story. So then I said to them, hey, I invited them to be co-authors in the book and place their stories in the book. And I wrote some of their stories. The majority of them, I wrote them. And the name Echoes came about because these were the cries and the experiences that were started off. There were internal loud screams, but by the time people heard them, they were faint whispers. And we realized, like, this is the echo. Like, these are the echoes of men's lived experiences. And even being a man of faith, like, we wrote that book to be 100% honest. One thing I did not want to do was censor their story. I told them, I want you to talk. When we were, one of the things when we were writing, I told them, I said, I want you to say the stuff that you're afraid to say. The stuff that has always been inside that you have been ashamed or afraid to talk about because you felt like people would judge you or whatnot. And that's what they did. And it was a piece of work, a piece of art that we put together of our lived experiences that impacted our lives in major ways.
One of my favorite things is that it's written very much real, like urban language, things that, you know, and I told you I grew up before in a city. And so I was familiar with some of it, but it made it quite real in that their language and the way they were telling their story was really them, is really what they were going through on a daily basis, and it was quite impactful.
Thank you. And you know what it did? The powerful thing that everyone has said to me, and especially other survivors, they all said, or they all say, I was able to see my experience in this. You put verbiage, you put words to what I could not explain. And so amongst the wide spectrum of experiences there, a lot of men, they pick up that book. Some of them can't put it down, and some of them have to put it down because they're like, it's too real. Like, I'm reliving my experiences because I've never seen my narrative shared.
After you had put this book together, did you learn anything about yourself? Were there any new revelations that came forward that you're like, oh, I didn't know that this was something about myself? Or
Yeah. So I realized that in this space, that for me, this is a divine calling. That's number one. To help men journey to wholeness, to provide healing spaces for men to journey to wholeness from sexual abuse, to acknowledge the injustices that exist in many households of faith, right, and many communities, and to be a solution. Okay, so it made me realize what it did for me. It made me, and for me, and for every other survivor, male survivor, is that we are stronger than what we think. That we're not weak. That we're not insufficient. That we're not wimps. That we're not futile, but that we're stronger beyond our imagination. Most mental anguish and some PTSD that male survivors fight through, that they're never medicated for, that they're never pursue healing. They're just kind of dealing with it every day on their own a lot of times. It made me realize that we are strong, we are resilient, and what people tried to do to break us did not succeed. And so I realized that I was not weak, I was a warrior, and that often say this, that I realized that I was willing, and I am willing, to be the sacrificial lamb in this space. If that means that people and men that I may never meet are able to begin their journey to wholeness because of my transparency and my openness with my story and our work.
You talk about confrontation a lot, and you'd mentioned that not only did you confront the barber, but you confronted other abusers in your story. Do you think it's important to confront for everyone? Not all of us have that opportunity because by the time we tell our stories 25, 30 years later, our perpetrators are sometimes even not around anymore, not alive. What is the benefit that you felt about confronting, and do you think it's important to confront abusers?
To be honest, I do not think it's healthy for everyone to confront their abuse, especially if you don't know, the mental state of your abuser. If they are, if there's going to be retaliation, or even if it's going to trigger you if you don't get the response that you want or are hoping for, or, you know, if they're potentially violent. You just don't know. And so I was able to confront my abusers, number one, because these were people that I grew up with. That's number one. And I confronted them miles away from each other, hundreds of miles away from each other. And they did not know my location. They did not know where I was. They did not, you know, so, and maybe they could have found me on Facebook, but they were not in my world. And I was able to do that because I knew, you know, I just kind of knew that they did not have the capacity or the wherewithal to really do anything to me. When as I got older, I realized that they were in poverty too, that they were broken too, and that that at that point I had the upper hand. And I realized that they were very much more afraid of me than I was of them because I had started talking. So I do not think it's wise for everybody, you know, and I can't tell you what's good for you. What if you have a therapist, talk with your therapist and see what, you know, you and your therapist come up to. You know, for some it's not a good, for some it may be. I know for me, it was a part of my journey. And it was helpful in some instances, and for some it was not. You know, I just said, you know, for the preacher, he did not apologize. Until this day, he has not apologized. And it's still, you know, and when he talked to me, that last conversation, it made me spiral for like a good 2 weeks. And because I just have a supportive community around me in my work, I was able to, you know, kind of come back to some level of normal. But not everybody has that.
Yeah, I think, like you said, unforgiveness is drinking the poison and expecting the other person to die. I think that's a very powerful idea to have, especially for a lot of us, like you said. Sometimes we don't have that opportunity to necessarily confront our abusers, to be able to go back into the past. And the only thing we can do is to truly look at ourselves and love ourselves for where we were at, to say, you know what, it wasn't your fault, but we can move forward in a way that is productive and beautiful. I want to ask you, you know, where do you want to go from here? You're sharing your story, you're starting these great organizations, you're writing lots of books. Like, what else is coming down the pipeline for you that you're trying to, you know, dream into fruition?
Well, thank you for asking those questions. So, so like I said, I always often ask what questions. So what's next? And so for me, you know, we not only started Iamman, which was a broader organization that focused on adverse childhood and traumatic life experiences. So fatherlessness, underrepresented student groups, whatnot, men returning home from incarceration. We actually launched a specific organization called the Survivor Circle that solely focuses on helping male survivors of sexual abuse from urban communities journey to wholeness. So it's its own nonprofit organization. So we've launched that. We have representatives, you know, we have representatives and team members all around the country. We just established our amazing board of directors. We have our first fundraiser happening as well. You know, partnering with organizations that are like very supportive, and so it's amazing. And so we're looking to continue to build safe spaces, physical spaces for men around the world to help them journey to wholeness. I'll say that. Some of the things we have been able to do, like I said, we've done facilitated dialogues, conversations, but one of the amazing things we were able to do was an immersive art exhibition that highlighted the lived experiences of male survivors. It was amazing. It was breathtaking. It is. And so I'm really excited because I think we're going to be working with Voices Beyond Assault on some stuff, I think, in the future. So I'm really excited about that. We wrote a song called the Survivor's Anthem, right? And so it's called Break Free, but we call it the Survivor's Anthem. We've written songs, we've written music. We're working on, I just released a docuseries that highlights my stories. We're working on, and I'm so excited to announce it here, is that we've been working on our official documentary for the last 4 years. 3-4 years. And we just got a donor that said that they would pay for the post-production of our documentary, which if anybody that has done a documentary, it's a lot of money. And so they are donating up to $20,000 worth of work to get the post-production work done. So we're really excited about that. We have, throughout our organizations, we're partnering with various organizations and people, survivors around the country to do various work. So we have a 5K coming up as well in South Carolina. We have
you just wrote a new book, right?
Art exhibition. Say it again.
You just have a new book, a Latino.
Oh yes, we wrote a new book called Live, and it's we were able to write the book alongside an amazing brother. He's a Puerto Rican man who is around late 40s, 50s. His name is David Torres, and he came to me saying, "Hey, I want to tell my story." And so we were able to work together collectively to write a book called Live, helping Latino male survivors of sexual trauma find life after sexual abuse, and find life after sexual abuse and live again, something like that. And so it's available in English and in Spanish. And so that's an amazing book that we wrote, and it's out. It's doing really well. And so I'm looking forward to that becoming a bestseller. I'm working on another book right now, a guide to help pastors and people of faith counsel and work with male survivors of sexual abuse in a healthy way. And so a lot of pastors or men of faith don't know how, or people of faith don't know how to, address these complex issues. And so we're writing a guide, for that. We're about 35,000 words in on that. So I'm really excited about that. And we're just continuing to do the work in real time. We do live meetups in different cities. So the Survivor Circle, we have different meetups in different cities. We just had a meetup in the DC area not too long ago. We have one coming up, and we just did one in Atlanta. We have another one coming up before the end of the year. We have one coming up in Detroit as well. And and we have
amazing
in Chicago.
Amazing work, and we're amazing work, and we're just so thankful for you, and I'm thankful for you. And
Thank you.
with this was when I first broke my silence or needed to break my silence and tell my story. It was like I didn't know where to go either, and it's so amazing that the work that you're doing to help people find a place to be heard, find a place to begin their healing process, and I know we're very excited to be working with you guys on putting together a male survivors program in the spring in Los Angeles. We can't wait. I can't wait to work with you. I can't wait to meet you in person. We're both from, you are from Chicago, but I'm from the Midwest as well. I'd like to have you close by asking you, because you are a motivational speaker, you speak to a lot of survivors, and I can't think of one that I would like to hear this message from more than you. I'd just like to have you look at the camera and give a message to all of the survivors out there who are watching, of all male survivors of all walks of life. What would you say to them? What would you like to tell them?
Bro, I want you to know that you do not have to be bullied by shame. You do not have to be bullied by guilt, and you do not have to be a victim of what happened. The truth is, we cannot help what happened, but we do have the choice to decide what we do with what happened to us. And I want you to know that you are stronger than you are more than what has happened to you. And I want to encourage you to take back your power. How does that start? By, number one, acknowledging that, this stuff did happen. Finding safe spaces, connect with us, connect with any organization that focuses on helping male survivors. And get in a community that can help you, that can provide language for you, but also can journey with you. one healing step at a time. There is a place called wholeness, but we get there one healing step at a time. I want you to remember this if you don't remember anything else. Healing is the journey, wholeness is the destination. You get to wholeness one healing step at a time. And no one has the power to decide what healing looks like for you, how long it takes. But as long as you're committed to journeying wholeness for you, you'll get there one day. And you'll be able to do what you want. And you won't have to settle for the version of you you created and survive or thrive.
Robert, that was absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for sharing those words. And again, we just want to thank you so much for joining our program today, for sharing just the harrowing things that you've gone through, sharing how you've been able to triumph over things, sharing how you've been able to break a lot of the systems and patterns that have existed in your life. And now being able to share that and being able to do the work for survivors, we know that you are on a path that will result in so much healing for male survivors. We're so excited for Survivor Circle. We're so excited for our events in the spring, and we can't wait for everything that's coming down here. We'll be supporting you all the way through.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you, Robert. And thanks to all of you who joined us today, whether you joined our live program or the recorded version. We hope you found this discussion enlightening, comforting, and helpful with your healing process.
Thank you all again to all the survivors out there for your continued support of our programs and the organizations such as Voices Beyond Assault, for I Am Man, for Survivor Circle. It's your courage that gives us all strength. Thank you.
Hands on my chin, I was lost and looking in the glass of time. Was it just the wine made me cry? I hope I'm satisfied. I saw myself, an older man, folding up his paper plans and hiding it in his hands. Made me say, am I okay? Don't say too late tomorrow, too late tomorrow.